Effective business communication. It's one of the most critical skills that you will need going into the workplace, including as you go forward as an intern and in getting involved on campus. The big objective for this chapter is that we want to identify the communication concepts, define communication and its models, and establish some examples of context. All of this is based on the textbook that we have for the class this semester, which is Business Communication for Success. Be sure to read those chapters before you listen to these lectures. For this class, we'll also be providing you with guided lecture notes for each major lesson. Right here, you'll see that the 4 big takeaways for this class are that we want you to know the 8 essential components of communication, be able to identify those in real life, understand the models of communication, including transactional and constructivist, and be able to identify the types of interference and noise, and then be able to talk about the 5 different examples of context. So, why does this matter? Why do we need to communicate well? The objective here is that communication is critically important in gaining a better understanding of yourself and of others. We're using communication to solve problems, to learn new things, and to build your career. So what is communication? There isn't an exact definition here. The key word that we do want to think about, though, as we start to look at these definitions, will be the idea of meaning, which you'll see in bold there. The book definition is that communication is the process and understanding of sharing meaning. Another definition would be the process of deriving meaning from symbolic messages. So the constructing an idea into a message that is sent through a channel to another receiver who decodes the message, that might be a way that you've heard it in speech class, and that's something we'll talk about today. And communication right here doesn't have to be something that's on purpose. For example, if you walked in late to a traditional class, you're giving a communication meaning right there. And for different people, depending on your context, depending on if it's raining or if it was just your regular class meeting, everything starts to change. So the process is a dynamic activity based on feedback. We're sharing, we're not communicating alone, and we really want to think about what our meaning is. What are we sharing through communication? So what's the big deal here with meaning, and what's the difference between meaning and message? Let's use this example. So let's say I walked up to you in class and I said, I love you too. It's not just a message. There's a social things going on there. There's context. It depends on the pattern. It's dynamic. So if just a buddy in class walks up to you and says, hey, love you, bud, it means something really different than if you're dating someone and they say, I love you for the first time. You can also think about if you're texting someone and they text, I love you, and you're all, love ya too, with the numeral instead of the word. It means something different. So it's important to understand the difference between meaning and the message. I love you too differs in meaning. It depends on who says it. So we need to be really careful to understand the full context and what's going to be happening when we start to say stuff like that. Social expectations will play a role here. We'll also think about the idea that context matters. The idea that whether or not you're saying this to someone's face, whether or not it's a text, whether you're saying it to somebody in class or you're saying it to your grandma when you're giving her a hug. The context for all of that matters. And our interactions, including I love you, start to have a pattern. And people know when, well, some people in a relationship will say I love you every time they walk out the door. But saying love you when you walk out the door is different than if you're having a romantic evening and saying that while looking into somebody's eyes. Our interactions are also really dynamic. We say something to someone and they're going to give us feedback on that. It's not just that we're taking messages and throwing them out into the void. And this is, I know I've been using a lot of dating examples here, but all of this plays back into the workplace too. So the big thing I want you to remember off of this is that the meaning is not just the message. It's not just the words that you picked. Our communication is going to be super layered. So our message form is going to both enable and constrain us. This semester in this class, we'll be talking about a couple different forms of message, including how you might communicate on LinkedIn versus how you might introduce yourself in an interview. You're going to be thinking about different choices, making different decisions, and taking different actions depending on that. The other thing that I want you to know right at the beginning of the semester is the 8 components of communication. So that is understanding and being able to identify a source, a message, channel, receiver, feedback, environment, context, and interference. We'll talk about some of that today, but those are all key terms that we'll continue to use this semester. For context, the definition that we're going to be using is the setting, scene, and expectations of the individuals involved. Here's a quick way to think about that. Let's say your team member in a class this semester, in this class or another one, were to text you. How long do you have for that response time? What if a team member is calling you? What if it's an email? Let's flip it to a different person. Let's say I texted you or called you, which I don't normally do, but let's say I'd gotten your phone number from the university. How long before you reply to that? What if it's an email? So you can see, depending on what's going on or even when in the semester it is, you'd make really different choices on where you'd go with that. And as a lot of you may have experienced this year, there's challenges to this. Technology has changed. We're using video conferencing now more than ever before. Business hierarchies have been flattened. It used to be that you wouldn't be the person presenting to the client if you were the ITS girl, but now you might be out in front of that client, so you need to be able to give a presentation. Business has gone global. So you need to be able to identify what are key concepts that might need to change in your communication depending on to whom you're speaking. Remote workplaces. So you need to be able to manage your email, manage your time, be able to identify, hey, I've got a 10 a.m. Zoom call with John, but John's in New York, so if I set it for 10, am I saying my time or John's time? Generational differences are huge too. There's going to be different expectations, different levels of comfort with technology. I personally have seen where some people have both over and underestimated different generations. There'll be cultural differences. Think about the idea of proximity when you're standing next to someone in a classroom. How you might stand is going to depend on culture, and you've even seen with social distancing that our culture can change really quickly. And language differences. One of the funniest things I've seen is when people will try and adopt slang or what they think is common language of someone who is not in their demographic or generation, and it just tends to really fall flat. And 2 other big challenges that I've seen, and I'm guessing a lot of you have seen this past couple of years too. We have this idea of cancel culture. I have a friend who owns a small business and nothing big, but she had done a product release on her social media and was picked up by a group that felt like she wasn't being considerate of all the different potential audiences for her product. So what happened is, rather than just coming to her or addressing it privately, it was put in other places on a Facebook group, and then she had hundreds of people coming to her business page and criticizing her behavior. What we consider ethical and appropriate has been definitely somewhat in flux. We also have this huge blur between private and public communication. If you were to tell my students 15 years ago that they could get fired for some random comment they put on social media, they would not believe me. But I think that's something I can say to you now, and you're not going to be surprised. I saw someone locally who works at a big insurance company, or worked, because what happened is they posted a racist comment on a Facebook post, and somebody screenshotted that, sent it to someone they knew who also worked at that big insurance company, and that person was really promptly fired. So that distinction, thinking I can get away with this unethical behavior, has changed a lot. It's just not what it was a few years ago, which means you need to be really careful how you communicate both in your private life and publicly, because companies are increasingly expecting you to be a representative of wherever you work. So in this class, we're going to be looking at two big models. That's the idea of constructivist and transactional models of communication. Constructivist, we focus a lot on the common ground. So what is that? I'm showing you here on the screen a picture. What are those? So all of you just thought a word to yourself, whether that's pop or soda, or if you're like me and from Texas and you're thinking that's a Coke, everything in that picture is a Coke, but I want specifically a Diet Dr. Pepper. We have meaning there that we've created, and the meaning itself is in this message that's existing. So the idea there that the packaging can't be separated from its social historical context. So it's this idea of we're performing whatever that meaning is. It's really much more complicated than what people originally thought communication would be. The other way that you could think about this is you think about a friend who gets upset somewhat easily. And you're going to tell them, I'm bailing on you. I'll put it the simple way. You're not going to be showing up this weekend to where they thought they were going to go with you. So yeah, bail on them. What do you tell them, and how do you do that while not offending them? You make that choice based on a lot of knowledge of how that person's going to take that meaning and do what they will with it. It's not like we can just take this message and drop it into the void. And here's what that void looks like. This is the linear model of communication. The linear model is the way actually college courses used to work, where a professor would be the source. So you think of this older professor standing in front of a giant lecture room where they're going to just stand up there and impart knowledge. If we were to go back 150 years ago, there's professors who would show up to a classroom and they wouldn't even necessarily be expected to speak on topic. They could just stand up there and talk about themselves and their view on nature and the way the flowers were growing on the way to the building for hours. So you can imagine that. And I'm not talking about them talking about that in a nature class. I mean, you could show up to your math class and just ramble on. They don't care what you, the receiver student, thinks. They just care about taking and dumping that information. In the business world, an example would be a senior executive who uses mass communication to deliver really critical messages by email from their beach house in Bora Bora or something, but they're not showing up to team meetings. We know a team is going to work better when we have some feedback. So communication scholars started looking at this and thinking, this doesn't work. They're in communication, that idea of a linear model and dumping information into the void isn't really practical. So they moved to this idea of the more interactional model. So I would take information as a professor, I'd send it to you. You would take that information, you'd send it back to me. The boss is listening a little bit, but is it really working? Still no. Communication is a lot more complicated. This is the third model, and the model that we're going to be focusing in on this class. That's the idea of the transactional model of communication. The idea that, let's say I have this lecture, I'm putting it into a video, so video is my channel. I'm the source. This video and the slide is my channel. I've got this message, all these ideas that I want to get across about the transactional model. I'm giving them to you, the receivers, What's hard right now is I can't see you like I would in a normal classroom, but I am getting feedback from you by email, by reading the discussion boards. So you're sending all of that to me. I'm taking it in. And then when I go to make my next video, this is ideally, I adapt it and I change things so that when I send you my next message, it's easier for you to decode that information that I have sent to you. And it's easier for me to encode all of what I'm trying to say to you. Think about this in a workplace example right here. You can see the speaker who's there in the background. He is encoding his message. He's using a couple of different channels right there to get across to his audience. And you can see his audience, even though they aren't talking, are giving different kinds of feedback. Some people look more interested than others. Some people are more engaged than others. It really varies. You'll also notice that we start to have some noise and distractions that are going on there. Absolutely, if I were in that room, I am distracted by windows, so I won't lie. I'd probably just have to fight that and probably sit to where the guy is sitting so I'm not looking out the window the whole time. There's distractions like maybe somebody's chosen to wear really bright leopard print pants and it's not an office that normally does that. There can be all different kinds of noise that can happen there and distract people. Noise can be internal or external. It can be physiological or psychological, environmental or linguistic. A couple of examples here. Really, noise can be anything that distracts from the message. It could be hunger, it can be worries, it can be loud clanging, it can be people out in the hallway yelling on their headsets as they play a video game, which is happening to me right now. Linguistics means it could be an accent, speaking in a different language, or even jargon or technical language. When you get to JSOM, there I go even using that jargon, you're getting to JSON and you're taking BCOM, and BCOM's going to introduce you to the CMC. That is a whole lot of external linguistic noise because I'm using all this jargon that you're learning right now or have already learned. Environmental distractions can be physical distractions. That can be sirens, flashing lights, bright slides, smells. And internal noise can be physiological or psychological, like I said. You're hungry, or psychological. You're thinking about a big meeting that you had. You're distracted. Any of that can start to pull you away from where you're supposed to be thinking. All right, so with the idea of communication and context, we do want you to be able to identify the major context for communication in this class. So the first thing that you might do to think about this is imagine that you're on campus and you're walking down the hall and there's those big screens up. What's a word or an image that would get your attention if you saw it on the screens in JSOM? Maybe it's a free event, a funny picture, a video. Maybe it's an image of somebody that you know. On the flip of that, let's imagine you're walking down the hallway in the dorm or in JSOM, and you can see, because we often do this, you can see what people are looking at on their phone screens. What do you notice? We know that in that changed context, you're going to have different things showing up on those private screens than you would on the public screens. So if somebody had a free event flyer pulled up on their laptop in the hallway, probably not going to notice. Somebody has pulled up TV, let's give a really nice example, like a TV show that you really enjoy. You might just kind of look over and think about what episode was that. So really important there to remember that the different types of contexts are going to matter. The other thing that I want you to think about here is the idea of a responsible communicator. And I want you to know the two main responsibilities of a business communicator. One, that you need to be prepared. So that means that you are organized, you're clear, you're concise, you're punctual. And then two, that you're ethical. So egalitarian, respectful, trustworthy, and practices that idea of the golden rule. One example that I've used in past classes that maybe will work for you here too is that the concept of showing up to an internship. So as a communicator, let's say you're running late. Maybe you have a really legitimate reason, like you had a flat tire. What should you do? You should definitely contact your supervisor so they understand that, hey, you're running late. But let's say the week before you had also said you had a flat tire. It wasn't true. You just overslept. By being unethical in the first communication, you're going to ruin your credibility, or at least degrade your credibility going forward. With the preparation, you might think about a team presentation that you have here in JSOM. A lot of the classes use these. Imagine that you have a team presentation. There's 4 of you. It's worth 20% of your course grade, and someone simply does not show up at the start of the presentation. They've texted you from the parking lot that they're on their way, they're trying to make it, and what are you thinking? Like, why is this person not already in the classroom 10 minutes early? That lack of organization, the lack of clarity, because I've seen where people say, hey, I'm in the parking lot, but really they're still driving or in their dorm getting dressed, is going to completely ruin their sense of being a competent speaker, because they've not really paid attention to the 2 primary responsibilities there. So be careful with that. The one way I would suggest to people that you could avoid that once you are at the point of having on-campus in-person presentations is make a really clear agreement with your team that everyone should be there 15 or 20 minutes before the start of a major presentation, because a lot of classes will expect you to present even without that person. So what responsibility do you also have to your audience? What responsibility do you have as an audience to the speaker? Well, some of that's going to depend on the setting, but it can really vary through a lot of different concepts. So we have this research that suggests that short sentences and straightforward grammar and simple vocabulary can increase comprehension. But what does that mean? I mean, if somebody at your workplace doesn't understand what you're talking about, do you expect them to go look it up, or do you use words that they can understand? My big point here, as far as your responsibility to your audience and your audience's responsibility to your speaker, is that we go back to the idea of the 2 big responsibilities of a communicator. You need to be careful with what you say and ethical with what you do it. That's where that golden rule comes in, the idea that you need to be kind and considerate. My big point though here is that you're there to, and this is for your internship, this is for a group project, you're there to effectively communicate and be understood. You're not there to teach vocabulary. So here's a way that I want to drive this home for you. 20% of adults in North Texas can't read this sentence. That was in 2018. The projected numbers now for 2019 is that we're at 26% of adults in North Texas can't read this sentence, and these are people who are able to speak English. And that should be really scary. So you might see this and be like, well, what does that have to do with business? It has a lot to do with business and how we think about how we communicate. Here's example number 1. You may or may not remember this menu. This was from McDonald's a couple of years ago. And so what they had done is introduced this really complicated menu. As you can kind of guess, for some people, this made it a little tricky to order. There's a lot to read on there, a lot of different selections to make. It also made it difficult for the employees to enter all of that information in. And that plays back to the idea of literacy. So if you aren't a super fast reader, but whether that's your employee or your customer, what should you do instead? So what McDonald's knows and has done all over the world is it made it really easy to order a Big Mac. It doesn't matter what country you're in. You can say, hey, I want a number 1, and you're going to get what they're showing you. The picture is up there. Also makes it easy if, well, here we've got, I think, Switzerland. Again, number 1 for our Big Mac there. You can hold up the right finger, not the wrong one, but hold up a finger to order a number 1. This also makes it a whole lot easier when we're on the flip side of that, when somebody is being trained on how to enter those and we're trying to get the crazy fast drive-through times, which are something that these companies track and report and are a little competitive on. But you have to make these simple enough that somebody can hit the right button without a lot of training. If we know that 1 in 4 people can't read maybe anything too complicated, we need to think about how do we simplify what we say to get what we want. McDonald's knows, in review, they're not there to teach English. They're there to sell food and move people through really quickly. So I'd encourage you to start observing what big businesses are doing when we go through all of these concepts this semester. Think about how you can see those applied in your part-time jobs, where you're going to start to see those in your internships, and also see it in the different assignments that we have this semester. So again, the big things we covered today are those 8 essential components of communication. I talked a little bit about what they look like in real life. We talked about some different models of communication. The 2 I want you to know are transactional and constructivist. You don't need to worry about the others. We talked about different kinds of noise that you can experience that can distract from the message. And we went through some of the big concepts of what are different types of context. To be clear, those are interpersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass communication. For all of these different presentations, I'd encourage you to go back to the different slides and start to think about those and review the information in the textbook as well. Well, that's a wrap on Chapter 1.